Okay. I sent you some photos from my last visit on Friday to some coffee farms.
Okay, I'll take a look when we're later today. Thanks.
Right.
Even we're learning things. Harvey's learning how to use WhatsApp, and Graham. Vitor, is Tulio going to join you, or is he going to be separate?
No, today we will be separate.
Okay.
We're getting back to being in person, Graham. We don't have to learn any more of this technology.
But he's coming. He just writes me in the group. I think he had some bad connection, but he's trying to learn you.
And here he is. So terrific,
Yes.
terrific. It's 4:01, so we'll get going here in a minute or so. Thanks to everybody for coming again. In Canada, one of the things we often do is we always do is we talk about the weather. It's just something that happens. On Friday, Rick Eistad said the weather was 24 degrees Celsius. Today, I can tell you it is -1 degree Celsius. And yet both days were nice and sunny. So that's why we talk about the weather. It changes very, very much. So I'm just going to share my screen here. And we go. And introduce. So to start off this meeting, one of the things that I wanted to share with everybody was, as you know, the Friday Zoom, we had moved it to Thursday and wanted to clarify that for everybody. Same time, but on Thursday, because we know Easter is coming up and Friday is a holiday in most of our countries. So it will be Thursday, April 14th. It is the same Zoom link that you use. And just a reminder that looking forward to hearing from Emilia, sharing on agriculture at home in Bolivia and her personal experience there. This week, we have another request for you. So as we're now into week 5, so we have 2 weeks left, and we do have an ask for all the participants. On April 26th will be a closing event. We'll have a chance to celebrate what we've done together. And we have a request from each of you as participants. We'd like, and this will come out in an email, but I just wanted to share with you today so you're aware of it. We'd like you to share your experience with us so we can share it with the mentors and all of the presenters. Just a 1-minute video. You can do it on your phone or your mobile device is fine. And then we'll put them all together for the April 26th session. We want you to just answer 3 quick questions. What did you enjoy most about this experience? What was one key learning that you gained from the sessions? And how will your experience with this program, how will you use it in the future? How will it help you in the future? So that's a 1-minute video, if you could do that. Another one is, we thought there's been a lot of people help us through this session to create the material. So in the 18 sessions that we have, the 12 that are learning sessions, we've had probably 10 different presenters, all very experienced, very busy people that have taken the time to do it. So we're going to put a clip together, a little bit of a thank you, and would ask you just to do a quick video clip in English and in your language, whether it's Spanish or Portuguese. Just a quick thank you, very short, in English and in your language. You could say your language. And then for both of these videos, just send them to me and I will compile them for the presentation. You can send them by email or WhatsApp. And we don't need this right away. We want you to think about it over the next couple of weeks, but I will send an email tomorrow with this request. And if you could get it to us by April 24th, that's a Sunday. So I have time to put it together for the presentation on April 26th. Any questions on that, you can certainly ask me on WhatsApp. So moving on to today's presentation. This week, it's going to be, sorry, it's asking me to update my software as we speak here, so I'm just can't. This week is on soil and water conservation, climate change, and Wayne Lindwall, who's been with us all through the session here, has been a facilitator as part of our NGSE team, is our presenter. So let me introduce Wayne to you, if I can. Wayne's got a broad experience. Wayne grew up on a dry land grain farm in the area that we're talking about, just south of Lethbridge, so in the very southern part of Southern Alberta. And his first degree was a Bachelor of Science in Agricultural Engineering from the University of Alberta. After graduation, he worked for a number of temporary positions, research officer, and then ultimately worked for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. So that's our national agriculture, Department of Agriculture. As a tillage engineer at the Lethbridge Research Station in 1996, and initiated productive and rewarding career as one of the innovative research leaders in soil conservation, research, and no-till. And he also, from that, as a consequence of that, was supported to complete a doctorate, a PhD in agricultural engineering at Iowa State University in 1983. We were talking earlier, Iowa, the state of Iowa is a very productive agricultural state, one of the most productive in North America, and outproduces almost all of Canada in grain, just in that one state. In his career, he headed the Land Resources Science section in Lethbridge from 1986 to 94, acting director in 1996, and then was director Semi-Arid Prairie Agricultural Research Center in Swift Current, Saskatchewan, just to the east of us, from 97 to 2002. And then finally, Director General and National Program Leader of Environmental Health in Ottawa, our capital, from 2002 to 2007. So Wayne has had a long career in the topic that we're talking about today, and as well has received numerous awards, including Ag Engineer of the Year, induction into the Canadian Soil Conservation Hall of Fame, Outstanding Achievement Award from our Prime Minister and our Governor General, and most recently received the Distinguished Alumni Award from the University of Alberta. And the video is in our reference material showing a bit of his background. He's also published 60 different scientific papers or book chapters and more than 250 technology transfer releases. Most importantly, he has been a Rotarian for 25 years and has 3 sons and 4 grandchildren. So without any further, I'm going to turn it over to Wayne to talk to us about soil conservation. I'll just stop sharing my screen and allow Wayne to do it. Wayne, over to you.
Thank you very much, Graham. Can everyone hear me and see my screen?
Yes.
Looks
Yes.
Good, thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you all again this afternoon and this evening, I guess, wherever it may be in South America. But it's my privilege today to talk a bit about what I've spent most of my career working on, and that's soil and water conservation. Where I started my career here in Lethbridge. It's very unusual for someone that's grown up in the area on a dryland farm about 60 kilometers from where I'm sitting now to be able to work at the largest agricultural research center in Canada. And it was just at that time one of 30 research centers in Canada to be able to work very near your home. So that was a real privilege for me. And obviously I learned a lot as a student, having the opportunity to work with mentors and some outstanding soil scientists early in my career. So today, I'm going to give a bit of a review. Like over the last 4 weeks, we've heard a lot about Canadian agriculture, about agricultural cropping systems in Alberta particularly, and some of the history of how young our soils are and how our soils were formed through glaciation. And we've heard about the climate and the fact that we live in a semi-arid region of Canada, and that presents a whole new range of challenges. But you've also seen some outstanding technology, both in terms of crop management systems and agricultural equipment, success of our farming operations. And the landscapes have changed dramatically just in my lifetime. Obviously, I'm much older than many of you, so I've seen a lot of changes over that time. So I think it's important to share some of my experience that things always weren't as good as they seem right now because we had some serious degradation problems. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the global perspective of soil and water conservation since having had the opportunity to travel to many countries, I think 55 or 60 countries in my career, and worked a lot in India and China, particularly Africa, a couple of trips to South America, Brazil, and Argentina as well, Australia, particularly countries that have had some of the challenges in terms of soil conservation, carbon sequestration. As Graham mentioned earlier, I also served on the Canadian team for Kyoto and was the token agriculture rep trying to get agricultural soils recognized globally as a potential source of carbon sequestration. So I'll be talking a bit about that later and particularly on Wednesday. So I'm going to cover a bit of the history that you've already heard, just to remind everybody where we're at. Talk a bit about the quiet revolution that we observed in conservation tillage and why it was a quiet revolution, because it happened over 40 or 50 years. And most importantly, really what do we mean by the value of topsoil, and why should we care about the value of topsoil, and some of the global impact that we can have in agriculture on sustainable land management. As you've already seen similar maps to this, I think Rob done the first week, and I think you've seen similar maps as well over the course of the training. But the agricultural area or the arable land, and despite the fact that Canada is one of the largest countries, we just have a very small percentage of our land, only 4.4% that's arable. And as you've already learned, most of that is on the prairies, Saskatchewan and Alberta particularly. And the other big challenge that we have in Canada is that we have a very small farming population. And in Alberta, for example, only 40,000, less than 40,000 farmers, making it much different than the situation in other countries, including South America, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia. So it's a very small farming population. So we don't have a large voice, in terms of government policy. So we have to really emphasize that we're doing the right thing if we want to maintain the support that we've had for research, because we are a big exporter, as you've heard many times, exporting 75% of our production globally. So it really depends on those markets, and we have to protect those markets. You've also seen this map a few times, again, characterizing the soil types on the prairies. Particularly the one I want to refer to is that we're farming in the brown soils on the driest area in Southern Alberta and southwestern Saskatchewan, where the soil organic matter levels are only 2 or 3%. But in all of our agricultural soils, since they were first broke 135 or 140 years ago, we've lost about 35% of the soil carbon. And that was particularly the first 50 years. Just the way we farm the land. And then it was recognized, about 60 years ago that we had to change the way we were farming because we couldn't afford to lose any more of that soil carbon or organic matter. And it wouldn't be sustainable. So I'll talk a little bit about that later, but I particularly want to reference this Palliser triangle, but I don't think we've talked about that before. But Captain John Palliser was one of the technical experts when they were settling the West, and the Canadian Pacific Railway was established in the late 1890s. And they sent out a number of experts, some from Europe, some from Eastern Canada, to sort of decide on the suitability of our land area for agriculture. And he basically provided a report to our political masters in Ottawa that this Palliser triangle area, and it was approximately the same thing as our brown soil zone, but he said this area is not suitable for agricultural production. And we're dreaming in Technicolor if we think we can farm this area, just because of how dry it appeared to be, and it's better to leave it into grass and the buffalo that were roaming on those prairies. So it was a pretty profound statement, and a lot of people since have said, well, maybe that he was right, because we've had some tough times, and I'll discuss some of those in a few minutes. But that area was named after Captain John Palliser, and obviously, as you well know, that's one of our more productive farming areas, partly because of irrigation, but because we've learned how to farm the land in a sustainable manner. But I did want to emphasize the moisture situation. As Graham said at the beginning of the session today, we talk about the weather a lot in Southern Alberta because, and I remember growing up on the farm, my father was always concerned about the rain and the snow and the wind and the dry conditions that we were experiencing, particularly this time of year. But I think I wanted to emphasize, and I'll talk a little bit more about this on Wednesday because we're talking about climate change, but we have witnessed significant evidence of climate change, particularly in the last 30 or 40 years, that our average precipitation is dropping. And we've also have enough data now to show that our soil temperatures are going up by about 2.2 degrees on average. We've been measuring these very carefully. Our Environment Canada has been measuring all this information for more than 100 years. So in addition to being drier, and I didn't put the data that I mentioned the other day, but the last 4 or 5 years have been even drier. In fact, the precipitation levels over the last 21 months is half of the long-term normal, which is pretty unusual. And we're not sure what the outcome might be, but we'll talk a bit about that later. So it is very dry. And the other thing that, I don't think we've talked about our Chinook winds. I don't recall anyone discussing that, but we have a very windy climate here. And because we live in close proximity to the Rocky Mountains, we get these high dry winds 6 or 7 times at least over the winter. That really melts our Aboriginal population, our Indigenous population, call it the snow eaters, the wind, because we rarely have more than 15 to 30 centimeters of snow buildup because of these dry winds. So our land is often bare because our temperatures can go from -20 in the winter to +15 in a matter of 24 hours. That's a very dramatic change in temperature. So from -20 to +15 in 24 hours. So you can understand, how fast the snow can disappear and then leave the land susceptible to wind erosion particularly. And it's usually about this time of year I get people sending me pictures of dust blowing around the Lethbridge area saying, Wayne, what are you going to do about this? And I haven't been involved in this kind of work for 15 or 20 years, so I really appreciate this, getting this request for advice. So I've mentioned, I think we can all appreciate that the challenges of soil and water conservation are universal. This doesn't happen in Canada. It happens all around the world. And I think we can all appreciate that global food security, particularly in developing countries, particularly in countries that have large populations, they very much depend, on the water particularly, but also the conservation of soil. And unfortunately, the soil and water resources aren't distributed equally. Many countries do not have adequate water, do not have adequate quality water, and many countries have degraded their soils substantially. And I'll talk a bit about those, particularly in China, and many European countries as well have lost their most productive land because of degradation. And the arable resources are declining, as you well know, due to urbanization, soil degradation, erosion, and most recently climate change. And our surface and groundwater supplies are declining because of the growing demand to feed the world. And for the most part, a lot of the populations in particularly countries like China are demanding higher protein and more food. And that food has got to come from somewhere. And so China really spends a major effort on trying to be sustainable, but also being independent, so they don't have to depend on exports from other countries. Much has been written about soil degradation over the years. And my grandson, my 14-year-old grandson who lives in Calgary, called me up last week. He's working on a school project, and they're discussing the impact of global events on the population or on the lives. And obviously they're focusing on COVID. And because it's a global issue, it's affecting everyone in the world. But part of the challenge of their particular school project that he has is they asked him to talk to your parents and grandparents about other major events that impacted the global population. And so I guess his dad said, oh, well, call your grandpa. He knows about all this stuff, and he can talk about the Depression. Well, I'm not quite that old. You know, I'm back in the 30s. So I've been around for some of the degradation, but he wanted to ask me about the Depression of the 30s. And the Depression of the 30s was throughout North America, as many of you may know. But it also had economic impact around the world because the stock market's crashing, food supplies were diminished. But the 30s and 40s led to a lot of government policy changes because it was so serious and it impacted the world. And again, there's been many books, many movies written or produced about the Depression. And so I learned about it from my parents and grandparents. I didn't experience it myself, but I heard a lot about it. And there's quite a few books. And I think one of the most famous movies about the Depression was The Grapes of Wrath. But there's been a number of movies that were produced in Canada as well, called The Drylanders and so on. But I've given a few, and I'll provide these references in my presentation or end of my presentation on Wednesday of all the references that I've used some of these. But some of the ones, the more recent ones, have received a lot of attention. Dirt, the Erosion of Civilization. This was written by a professor in land resources from the University of Washington. And it was published about 8 or 10 years ago. And basically he's taking the world to task for the way they've treated the skin of the earth. And he's talking about the skin because it's the most important organ, an analogy to the humans, because the skin is an important organ on humans. And he says people have ignored the importance of topsoil globally. And we've lost a lot of civilizations because we've ignored that issue. So it's quite an interesting book. It received a lot of publicity and a number of TV shows 8 or 10 years ago. The other one, the Soil at Risk one, is the one that I was involved in as well. That it was a Senate report published in 1984 in Canada that really changed land management practices because they put a significant amount of millions of dollars of research into soil conservation as a consequence of this 3-year report documenting how much erosion was costing society in Canada. And some of the quotes from that particular book, it was $1 billion a year that it was costing society. And it was 600 or 700 million of that was the lost production by farmers as well. So that was a very important book and report. And when I was fortunate enough to receive the distinguished award from our Prime Minister and Governor General, he had asked me what I thought of that particular, because he thought that probably had as much impact on my career as anything. And the person that wrote that was a Liberal senator. But at the time, the Prime Minister was a Conservative, but he obviously did his homework, or some people did his homework for him. And he wanted to ask me if that report was probably the most important publication in my career. And it was probably one of the most important. And I think, we've also discussed some of the key principles of soil and water conservation, which are also universal. It's no secret there's been literally hundreds of textbooks written for universities and thousands of publications documenting how much crop residue is required to protect the land resource. And I can provide a number of those references, but it's well known that, you know, what doesn't matter what country you're in, the only way we can protect the soil is to keep it covered with crop residue, at least 30% cover, which is equivalent to about 1,500 to 2,500 kilograms of crop residue, so it's not exposed to wind and water erosion. And also encourage better land management practices and rotations that maintain or increase soil quality. And I think we've talked a bit about that we can't afford to excessively cultivate our land, and we should be putting crops and root systems that add organic matter back to the soil to help maintain those soil carbon and humus levels. And we shouldn't be breaking fragile grasslands, and there's still a lot of those grasslands globally as well, particularly in northern China and parts of the Soviet Union or Russia and other parts of the world. But there is so much pressure for food production that there's always a temptation by governments to break the fragile grasslands and forest land, and it's not sustainable. And again, we also want to encourage management practice that minimize the risk of contamination to our surface and groundwater by excessive use of fertilizer and chemicals. For many years, or for many decades in China, for example, fertilizer and pesticides were provided free to farmers just to maximize production. There was no incentive for conservation. And as a consequence, farmers are putting on double and triple the amount necessary to make sure they maximize the yield. Unfortunately, a lot of that excess nutrients run off the land or leached into the groundwater and surface water supplies. But that has changed, fortunately, in the last 15 or 20 years. So I was honored to, after I retired, I was invited by the University of Saskatchewan to document, you know, some of the history. We had a 3-day workshop in Saskatchewan of a number of farm groups and extension specialists and research scientists, not just from Canada, but the United States and around the world. And so we had a workshop and discussed what we've learned, lessons learned, what the mistakes we've made. And so I shared the authorship of that particular book with Bernie Sontag, who was one of my mentors at the research center as well, but he was also just before that he wrote this book, he was the Director General of PFRA, which is the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, that has recently been disbanded, but they were set up after the Great Depression in the 30s to basically help promote soil conservation practices on the prairies. So they had the responsibility of building trees, shelter belts on susceptible land, digging dugouts, and helping the farmers along with the researchers. So we both had the joint responsibility of putting this book together, and it involved the interviews of farm groups, of extension people, retired farmers, retired scientists, and we published that in 2010. So I'd be happy to give any of you an autographed copy of that book if you wish. So if I get your addresses, I'd be happy to send a copy of that. After we put that particular report together, naturally, you get lots of invitations to do presentations like this to community groups, to Rotary clubs, about what we learned and share that with the general public. Because again, a lot of the general public in the urban centers particularly aren't aware of some of this history, and they have not a complete understanding of the challenges facing agriculture. So for example, the shelter belts, things that you see on this slide on the left, you know, this is the way things looked back in the 50s and early 60s, where it was practical to have these shelter belts. But as the farm fields got larger with the big equipment, the farmers didn't want to deal with the trees around their fields to reduce the wind erosion and protect the land. So we don't see many of these shelter belt areas around the fields anymore. So our only solution, you know, in the early 60s was to look at reducing tillage and direct seeding, our soil conservation practices. And we learned that we made a lot of mistakes because we didn't have adequate equipment. We didn't have suitable weed control methods. And there was a lot of debate about the safety of pesticides and so on that we had to work with. But in some of the reports that we worked with, we shared some of the examples, and I have a whole library full of photos such as this. This isn't snow that is blowing on this irrigated field. This was, again, I think that was a friend of mine who was a district agriculturalist here at Lethbridge, but this is only about 6 or 7 kilometers from Brady's farm, believe it or not, Brady. But it's just east of Lethbridge. And this is actually an irrigated alfalfa pasture where we see the soil blowing. It's 80 hectare field. And this particular farmer, he had fences on there to collect the snow because all the neighboring farms were dry land and it was pretty sandy soil and they weren't farming it very, very well. And so I think this was in 1997, this particular picture. But we estimated that in this 3-hour period when the wind was up to 130 kilometers for 2 or 3 days, the field to the west lost 75 millimeters of topsoil. So basically all of the topsoil that it had from an 80 hectare field, and it blew onto this neighboring area. And the reason I highlight this one is because it, I don't have the color photos here, but this was a very highly productive alfalfa pasture. And so it basically wiped out this pasture because it eroded the, it was such a wind blasting effect. It blew out the plants and blew out 50 millimeters of soil on this field, as well as the deposition of this blow soil from the neighboring field. So this is just one example of what can happen in a 24-hour period. But there was lots of these kind of stories and experiences that I had, and this one led into a lawsuit. Usually the lawsuits would end outside of court because the farmers involved didn't want publicity. But there are laws now basically that can charge the farmers that aren't responsible, that are responsible for not taking care of their land to pay the cost of some of this damage. And there's also examples, these dust clouds are pretty typical. And again, I had some photos come to me over the last few days, which I haven't seen for a number of years, but throughout the 60s and 70s, particularly in Southern Alberta, we would document maybe 11 or 12 days a year where we'd have dust clouds. And again, the Environment Canada would document these dust clouds. And fortunately, we don't see them that often, but if we have dry conditions like we've been experiencing this past 20 months, we can expect to see some of these kind of fields, maybe this year. It's just very difficult to say unless we get some precipitation, but it's not uncommon. And because in around an urban area like Lethbridge, much of the land to the west of us has been farmed by renters or absentee owners of some of the indigenous farmer or indigenous tribes that own the land in this area. And so it gets a fair bit of publicity if the land isn't managed carefully. And early in my career, I had to work with some of the indigenous population because they were very upset with the way the land was being managed by some of these absentee landowners. So land tenure it's not a big problem in Alberta, but roughly I think 15 to 16% of our land is owned by absentee landlords who are renting the property, and they don't necessarily take as good a care of it as they could. But I remember sitting down with many meetings with the elders from these indigenous populations in the area, and they were very upset with the way the land was being treated. And I can remember some of the messages that they were giving us that, you have to protect the land if you want it to protect us. And the land is a mirror of man's activities. The land is a mirror of man's activities. And nothing good comes from turning the earth upside down. These are some of the comments that I get from our indigenous population, that they're very concerned about the way the land was being managed. I did want to mention briefly some of the time I've spent in China throughout my career. And again, because of the glacial till soils, which are similar to the prairie soils, the landforms are very similar in Inner Mongolia and parts of the Soviet Union or Russia. And so, and particularly in Inner Mongolia and Mongolia, they haven't broken all of this land. And so we were invited to participate, with the policy and decision makers in Beijing. And so extension works quite a bit differently in China than it does in the free world, because if they decide people have to change land management, it will be changed. And there's no options for extension or volunteer work. But this particular project was interesting because Beijing were having the Olympics, Summer Olympics, I guess about 10, 12 years ago now, but they had these dust storms that would typically come from Northwest China or Inner Mongolia and Mongolia, but they didn't want to have any of these major dust storms occur during the Olympics. And they invited foreign experts, a couple of us from Canada, a couple from Australia, United States, to give them some advice of what they needed to do. And so basically, when we made our trip over there, we looked at some of the land that was being developed in Inner Mongolia, because it's a semi-autonomous region. They don't have as much control of the land, or at least central government in China and Inner Mongolia, and they don't have no control over Mongolia. But they have to try to be persuasive either by providing resources, but they basically encourage, I think one of my graduate students who was at Beijing Agricultural University said they provided something like $40 million for research to document the benefits of conservation tillage. And then he said when they found some success of that, and thousands, if not millions of farmers adopted this, and they doubled the money every year for 5 years. And they say that was the most dramatic change of adoption of conservation tillage in a very short time. So again, you can understand how a policy change, it took us 50 years to make some of the similar changes on the prairies of Canada, but the motivation by a central government in China, they could make things happen quite a bit faster. So it was a very interesting story, and we've been able to document some of this in reports. It was a 5-year project that I was involved in. So this gives you some idea of those landscapes in the Loess Plateau. I think you heard about the genealogy of Loess soils. Again, Loess soils are wind-blown soils, and there's millions and millions of acres of these Loess Plateau soils that, if they get the rainfall and have irrigation, it can be pretty productive. But these aren't your typical topsoils that we're familiar with the Canadian and US prairies. These are deep Loess soils, might be 3, 4, 5 meters of all the same texture, very little organic matter, less than 0.2% of organic matter. But again, because they need this land for production in this region, they were able to convince the World Bank to landscape millions of acres of this Loess Plateau area. And so they brought in heavy duty excavators, bulldozers from North America, from Europe, and they spent $1 billion contouring a couple of million acres in this area for agriculture. It was the most massive project for land moving ever documented, and it was pretty incredible to see. We spent a week going over these areas. It is quite productive now, but they irrigate much of this land, and the farmers, they might only own 2 or 3 hectares on this land, but because it's flat, they've leveled it off. They can get reasonable production with adequate fertility. It's sort of more like hydroponics in some respects, because it's not because of the quality of the soil, but at least it's not degrading any further or being run off by erosion, water erosion primarily. So you can imagine trying to farm this kind of land without the landscaping. So these are all terraces. Terraces isn't that unique. It's being practiced all over the world, including Europe and Africa. But it was just an example of a World Bank project that I was involved in. So again, a few things that we've discussed already, but I wanted to highlight some of the changes, why we've been successful in the prairies of Canada. We've already learned that an 80% reduction in summer fallow acreage, which means we're not leaving much idle land. Like with the summer fallow system, we left our land idle for 20 months, hoping to build up the moisture and nutrients. But when we found out it wasn't that efficient, that we only conserved about 50 millimeters of water and about 55 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen fertilizer, it just wasn't that practical. And if we left the land uncultivated, it was just as productive to crop it annually. And I think we've already talked about the fact that now we're up to 58% of no-till. I think we're 70-some% of conservation tillage, but 58% of our farmers use direct seeding now. And whatever traditional tillage is, it's used by the minority. We used to call this conventional tillage, but I guess we call it traditional tillage. And you have to remember that in some of our wetter regions of the prairies, in Manitoba and the black soil zone, it's not, the soil erosion issues aren't as severe and the moisture issues aren't as severe. So we still have a number of farmers that they feel they don't need to direct seed, and they can use appropriate tillage practices and still be sustainable. I think the thing that I'll be talking a bit about more on Wednesday is climate change, but one of the things we've been able to document in Canada is because we've been studying soils and soil quality and organic matter for over 100 years, that our soil scientists have long known the importance of soil organic matter, or soil carbon. So I don't know what possessed these soil scientists to save the soils that they in some of our long-term rotations. So for example, here in Lethbridge, we have crop rotations that have been continuing since 1910. So 110 years, 120 years. And some of this land has been continuously cultivated to wheat. And probably the last 40 years, it's been no cultivation, but we've got fallow rotations, we've got different rotations. And so we've been able to measure the soil carbon every year. And not only that, but they saved the soil from 110 years ago, so they can reanalyze it as well with some new techniques. And this has been very important to documenting globally that we understand a lot about soil carbon. And we also know that it's possible to increase soil carbon, which a lot of people didn't think it was possible. But based on the measurements that we've collected over the years, or our soil scientists collected over the years, in 1991 is when Environment Canada was first started basically wanting attention to agriculture and how much agriculture was contributing to global greenhouse gases, that our prairie soils were emitting 5 million tons of CO2 each year, 5 million tons of CO2 because of the way they were farmed. And this, remember, it was largely with the summer fallow system and conventional cultivation system. So we were emitting significant amounts of CO2 just because of the way we were farming. But with the adoption of conservation tillage, and particularly direct seeding, since 2001, prairie soils have been a net sink of 8 million tons. I think the number now is up to 10 million tons a year. So instead of being a source of CO2 because of cultivation, we are a sink now. So basically we're getting more carbon stored in the soil than we are emitting. And so this is help mitigate the impact of climate change. If our cultivated soils are conserving carbon, we're increasing soil carbon, and we've been able to document this. This is a pretty significant event. And right now, Canada is the only country that has documented this globally. So we do get a fair bit of attention over this. And so we had to have significant evidence to convince the 200 countries that are involved in the climate change negotiations that we had the evidence for this. And this is the reason that I was involved in some of these Kyoto negotiations for 20 years before I retired, to document this, because it was disturbing to me that the world, we're counting our emissions, you know, from agriculture, and agriculture is responsible for about 10% of global greenhouse gases. So it was like if you go to the bank and the bank is counting your withdrawals, but they're not counting your deposits, you know, deposits into your savings account. So this is the way we had to explain it to the policymakers globally, that if we're conserving, we can document that we're conserving carbon, we have to get credit for that carbon. You can't just count our withdrawals. You have to count what we're putting back and get credit for that, or our farmers getting credit for that. So that was the way we sold it. And we were able to convince, it happened to be in a meeting in Poland, that we finally convinced the global community that Canada should be recognized for this. As I said, Canada, we're the only country now that we're using it, our government's using it to help meet our CO2 reduction targets. So carbon trading has been going on now for probably 20 years, believe it or not. And so a lot of companies that have high emissions have paid farmers because they knew carbon prices would be going up. The government just announced, I think, an increase to $20 a ton for carbon. And so a lot of companies 5 or 10 years ago, when they knew this was coming, they would have a contract with conservation farmers and say, well, we'll give you $5 an acre because we want to buy your credits for some of our problems down the road. So it's kind of a controversial issue, but we'll talk a bit more about that on Wednesday.
Wayne, a quick question that came up in the chat, and maybe this is a good time to ask it, is what impact has the increase in soil carbon had on organic matter levels?
Well, that's why I say it's going up. Like we can document increases of 0.2 to 0.3 tons per hectare per year with direct seeding, but it takes about 5 or 6 years. So carbon and organic matter are one and the same. So you just have to keep that in mind. That's all.
So there, as carbon's being saved, organic matter is going up.
Yeah.
Okay. I also see, if you don't mind, a question. Vitor, do you have a question on this as well?
Yes, I'm seeing the meeting from my phone, so it's difficult to ask on the chat. But I have a question about the credit of carbon, because I'm working with it here in Brazil, the carbon footprint in agriculture, and here in Brazil it's very difficult to us to the market of the credit is very difficult to us because we don't have like a system of the government to sell our credits, and we can't see the real carbon footprint inside the farms. So in Canada, do you have some system, some government system to sell the credits from agriculture?
Yeah, a lot of there is a system, like we have models that have been set up and we can provide some of these references. So a lot of farmers have done the selling of the carbon on their own. Like we've been doing this for quite a bit of time, and the World Bank has been using the Canadian model. Actually, the carbon sequestration model was developed by scientists here in Alberta. And the provincial government here started using this, I think, for their carbon credit system 15 or 20 years ago now. So there is some references around that we can share this, but you're quite right. If you don't have the documentation, if there isn't measurements, it's very hard to prove carbon increases. Like we're starting to use remote sensing more for that practice, but a lot of companies now are using some of the satellite imagery to document the biomass inputs in countries like Brazil and Argentina, for example, showing how much carbon is going back on the land to help validate the arguments of some of the farmers saying that I've been putting carbon back, for many years. And if they have good photo records from some of these satellite images, you can document some of that. So that's another possibility that I'll talk a bit more about Wednesday. I just
Thank you.
wanna-
Here in Brazil, we have in sugarcane, we have a project here that are growing, but just in this case, in sugarcane crop, because they can produce I don't know how to say in English, but with the sugarcane we can produce alcohol to put on the cars. We say alcohol is a kind of I don't know how to say in English.
Yeah,
You can help
it's a
me.
biofuel, and so
Yeah,
it's a legitimate
Yeah.
production. And Brazil probably led the world in biofuel production as well. And
Yes.
I'll talk a bit about that as well on the climate change side. So, these are all excellent questions. I just, and it's sort of more related to how we're dealing with the climate change issue. But Brazil, for example, have been one of the leaders. One of the challenges, of course, with sugar cane and with corn, depending on what you do with the crop residue, it's the soil carbon is the carbon that is most important in terms of sustainability. But you have to do a complete, what they call a life cycle assessment of energy inputs, energy outputs. And, it can be done, but it can take significant amount of work by researchers and to document these things. But there is more attention being given to it now, especially as the price of carbon is going up. Can we move on here?
Wayne, could I just come back to the question on organic matter? I recall reading, this is years ago now, where since we broke the land, you said about 130 years ago or so, when we really started growing wheat, which was probably around the 1920s, I'm guessing. I remember reading a paper probably in the 70s or 80s that said since we started this practice of summer fallowing and lots of cultivation, we've lost 50% of our organic matter. Where are we today with respect to rebuilding that? Have we come halfway back, or what do you think?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, Rick. We haven't come all the way back. What we're trying to find out, and again, I've got some information that I'll be sharing with you about that exact question, because how much can we increase it over baseline levels? A lot of soil scientists claim that we cannot go above what was inherently there. It just is not natural, because everything comes to an equilibrium. But you're quite right that we lost 30 to 50% of our organic matter, and we've come back. We've brought back up to 1%. Like just increasing organic matter by 1% in 30 years is pretty dramatic. But it doesn't happen overnight, and that's what a lot of farmers get impatient. They think if they practice no-till for 3 years, they should get credit for 1% organic matter or millions of tons. Doesn't quite work that way. It takes a lot of years of measurement, and we have some good models now that predict what's realistic, and you can just do mathematical calculations to document what's possible and what's not possible. But we can increase it, and it's easier to increase soils that have lost the most organic. It's hard to increase, say, black soils, for example. If you've got a black soil with 4% organic matter, it's very hard to increase it to 5%. But we can increase organic matter from 1.5% to 2%, or 2.5% to 3%. And we've been able to document some of that. And there's a lot of publications that are, but again, it takes many years to prove this. And that's what we're trying to demonstrate to the policymakers.
Thank you.
Good. So moving on here, we've again talked about some of the history of cultivation, but the main point I'm trying to make here is that why were farmers so resistant to changing management practices? And you have to remember that when our early settlers were Europeans coming to the prairies, and they were used to using intensive tillage, particularly plows and so on. And it's very hard to convince them until they have a serious problem that maybe they should consider something else. And for the first 50 years that we cultivated, we were basically mining the good soil, the good organic matter soil, and we didn't really have to add fertilizer. We were getting good yields, but it wasn't until, as you pointed out, Rick, that we lost 50% that we realized we have to do something better, because we started losing that sustainability. So gradually our tillage practices had to change, but we weren't very popular, on the prairies. That Rick can probably remember some of the challenges that we faced when I suggested to farmers that they didn't have to cultivate. That's heresy. If you tell a farmer he doesn't have to cultivate the land, he says you should be fired. You should not be a research scientist. You have no right to say that you don't need to cultivate the land. And I think what our point was that we showed that, we didn't have economic herbicide to control the weeds, but we did prove that the primary benefit of cultivation was weed control. The primary benefit of cultivation was weed control. So if you could control the weeds effectively with non-residual herbicides, environmentally safe herbicides, then why shouldn't we try that? And so that's why it happened. But I think after the Dust Bowl, there was more scrutiny to our traditional practices. There was many books written, challenging the conventional wisdom that we can't afford to continue plowing our land. But in Canada, we didn't have, the big major companies like John Deere, Massey Harris, Massey Ferguson. They weren't quite ready for the breakthroughs in conservation tillage. So it was a lot of short line companies that developed the early planters, and so it took a while to develop suitable air seeders and so on before it was practical. And so farmers were building their own machines, for example. And again, that led up to that particular report that I was making. These are a number of slides that we've seen before, but when we started getting lawsuits and they were closing highways, we'd have serious car accidents on the highways because of dust clouds. That's when the government had to change their policies. And so that's what led to Senator Sparrow's report that I referred to earlier. But it basically took a consensus of opinion. It wasn't until the politicians got involved that they said we have to do something different. So they put significant amount of money into research and subsidizing the development of equipment or helping provide suitable equipment that was economic for farmers to use, and also subsidize some of the costs of the most expensive herbicides to try to get some farmers experience with it. We had the long narrow strips for many years, that were practical until the equipment got bigger. But then when the fields got wider, it wasn't practical anymore. And then we started having the erosion. So the strip farming that worked very well for many years to at least localize the erosion from field to field. But when they got, complete cultivation and wide open, it just wasn't practical. And obviously the shelter belts disappeared. But we had the Noble Blade was the first implement that developed by Noble cultivators here in Southern Alberta. And he received the Order of the British Empire for developing the first subsurface cultivator that controlled the weeds and still left all the crop residue on the surface. But as I said, a lot of the drills that we were using, they didn't provide the most effective seed placement, but because you're seeding into a very moist environment where the soil moisture is very near the surface, we had surprisingly good results even with some of the traditional seeding equipment. But some of the local companies would develop specialized hoe drills so we could plant directly into residue. But some of these photos are like 50 years old. I think this was a versatile hoe drill. But we had surprisingly good results because I remember one of my professors saying, he was an ag engineer, he said, the only reason we put the seed in the ground, Wayne, is to keep it away from the birds. He says, if you've got good soil moisture near the surface, you can broadcast the seed if you've got a good mulch there and create a good environment. So that was an interesting perspective. And we had so many on-farm demonstrations of equipment for farmers early on to give them some experience of some of the equipment that was available and the new air seeders coming along. So in the 80s, we had all sorts of field days to help the farmers to get some familiarity, with some of the new technology for direct seeding. And the farm organizations were pretty much the leaders, but the government They didn't have enough expertise in the extension side. So basically they turned a lot of the extension over to farm groups. So every province, including Alberta and Saskatchewan, had farm groups that basically led the conservation movement, and with some of the advice from researchers. Again, we've talked about the reduction of summer fallow. I don't have to repeat that, and the adoption of conservation tillage and so on. I wanted to emphasize, I mentioned earlier, I think in the first week when people were talking about roots and topsoil, the organic matter that's the most important is the root system, because it's basically adds the quality and the humus and the organic matter in the soil profile. And we should remember that the roots of most of our crops and most of our soils can go down to 1.5 meters. So many people think that the roots are only in the top 15 centimeters or top 50 millimeters. The roots can go down to 1.5 meters, particularly our winter wheat crops. And as I mentioned, our perennials can go down to 10 meters, our perennial crops, alfalfa and grasses. So again, this is organic matter that's going into the soil, and that organic matter adds quality to the soil, plus it adds channels for the moisture and the nutrients. And as long as you've got moisture there, that soil profile that you see there on the right, 2 meters deep, that's what we try to recharge. You think of it as a battery, a discharged battery after a crop has been taken off, and you want to recharge that battery with water. So that 1.5 meter profile, we could build up 150 millimeters of water before the crop is planted. So a lot of our yields come from stored water before we actually plant the crop. But it's also important to remember that the good quality organic matter is actually the root system. It's not the surface residue. The surface residue is important for protecting it from soil erosion, but the actual quality of the topsoil is dependent on the roots. That's why I say your roots. They're the most important. And also the biological activity. We didn't appreciate, I know I didn't appreciate it until our microbiologists and a number of our other scientists went out to our long-term no-till plots and found out how much life is in our topsoil that had been farmed under no-till for 15 or 20 years, of the earthworm population. And there's millions of microorganisms in a very productive topsoil. And those organisms do wonderful things in helping mineralize organic matter, break down herbicides and pesticides, and it becomes a very healthy soil. We think of the soil as being inert, but a healthy soil is alive. And that's what we try to find. And these earthworms, they can go down up to 1 meter deep, believe it or not. It's hard to imagine, but some of our long-term no-till fields, we had 300 earthworms per square meter. So globally, I think the thing that's quite interesting, since it's already been mentioned how much no-till is in South America, but 85% of the world no-till acreage is in North and South America. That's pretty astonishing. And Canada, is actually ranks behind the US in terms of total acres, Brazil and Argentina. I'm not sure exactly what they define as no-till, but I think it is conservation tillage. And no other country globally has more than 5 million acres. So it is pretty common in the North American and South American system. As I mentioned earlier, 56% of our cultivated land in Canada and 22% of the land in the United States. But globally, we still have a long ways to go, mainly because of a lack of technology. There's too much competition for the crop residue. There isn't government incentives, and they use that crop residue for other purposes, either heat or feeding their livestock. So there's competing uses for that crop residue. So I think I'm nearing the end here. And again, since we were talking about topsoil, what is the topsoil worth? Well, it really depends if you don't have any, how much value, and the same with land values. I guess if, we talked the other day of how much land is costing young farmers in Alberta. But if you had to go to a store downtown in your city to buy topsoil, you find out how much it can cost. 10 kilograms, for example, $13. A cubic meter for your backyard garden, up to $25 or up to $250, and even more for small acreages. So you can understand, the perception of what topsoil is worth when you look at the value of the land in these areas. So it's important to protect that value of that topsoil. Once it's gone, it's gone. How can you justify buying $8 to $10 million to buy a typical farm in Alberta? What determines the value of land or topsoil? Well, obviously the climate, temperature, all of the things that we've been talking about. And also the location, geological history. Our grassland soils that were inherently 3 or 4% organic matter before they were cultivated have high value as long as we farm them in a sustainable manner. Cropping systems are important. And obviously, we only have 15 to 30 centimeters typically of what we call our true topsoil that have high levels of organic matter. But the deeper your roots go, the more organic matter you can get to deeper depths. Because the deeper you go with your organic matter and roots, the safer that carbon and organic matter is. And as I pointed out to Rick, organic matter and carbon are one and the same. I think we all recognize the importance of carbon as one of the most important filters. We always talk, how do you filter things? Well, carbon filters are very effective. And carbon are the source of a lot of our energy, whether it's oil, gas, whatever. So we really don't necessarily appreciate carbon as much as we should. And that's why it's one of the, it's $1 billion trading industry in many respects, just buying those soil carbon reserve. So to help demonstrate to farmers and extension people, we moved soil around from all over Alberta and deposited it at our research plots here in Lethbridge, just to show what happens if you bring in soil that has 6 or 7 or 8% organic matter and take away the local organic or soil and deposit soils from all over Alberta into a same area and then compare the yields. So we did this about 15 or 20 years ago at 3 or 4 locations. Again, this was thanks to some of the funding we had through that Senate report to demonstrate the value of topsoil. And so we thought this was somewhat of an artificial way of showing it, but the darker the color, the higher organic matter content there. So we brought in black soils, dark brown soils, gray wooded soils here to Lethbridge, and we're monitoring in detail what happens over time and the yield and all the other soil benefits of different topsoils under one environment. And technically in 50 years, they should all become the same color. They should all go to a new stable level of 2 to 3% organic matter, which is our natural level. But I don't think that's going to happen. And as I said, we still have our 5 hectares of no-till land that we started when I was a student in 1967. So we've been able to maintain, as far as we know, this is the longest term no-till plots in the world. This land here has not been cultivated in 55 years. And we've been monitoring the yields off of this in that time. And, we've got the city building all around us, but as long as I'm around, it's not going to be cultivated. So I guess this is more leading into what I'm going to talk about on Wednesday. So I'm not going to dwell on this any further, Graham, but I think we'll be talking about some of this. I wasn't sure how much time we'd have, and I don't want to take too much time, so there's some time for questions. But we'll get into the impact that Canadian agriculture and global agriculture can have on the climate change negotiations in the coming years. And I think it'll tie in pretty well to some of the things we've been talking about. So I think I'll just skip to the end here, because I'll talk about some of those things on Wednesday. I wasn't sure how much time we'd have, so I don't want to take too much of the time. I know we're on a limited time, and I get a little long-winded when I'm talking about this stuff that I find so exciting, so I apologize that, but hope you found it interesting. So thank you so much for your patience. We'll talk a bit about more of this on Wednesday as well. I hope you found it somewhat interesting.
Well, thank you, Wayne. It's fascinating, some of the learnings that you have there and your history in this topic itself. It's interesting. My experience with farmers is conservation matters when they can conserve expenditure as long as it doesn't hurt crop yield. And I bet a lot of your work showed that you could safely protect your yield by tilling less. And what I found was farmers were interested in tilling less because it meant less tractor time and expense in the field. And it's proven out over the last 40 years that they can be as productive. But other interesting facts, the health of the soil, you said that as well, the health of the soil. And carbon has such an interesting presence today. It's a bad thing in the environment and it's a good thing in agriculture. And a little known fact is that no-till is actually helping, less carbon in the air, and it's actually good for the soil. So combine things, history, looking back, it looks very positive. There's no questions right in the chat, but I'm looking for hands up if anyone has any questions for Wayne. The presentation is already loaded in the learning sessions on the Zoom chat. So Vitor, I think you have your hand up. Question?
Yes, I'd like to know what is the average of the organic material on your dark soils, like when you see the analysis, the average, the percentage of
our black soils are typically 4 to 5% organic matter.
So that's about double what we'd see in the brown. And
yeah, that's about double. Some of them are as high as 7 or 8%, and we expected to see some decline. There's been several papers written on, I haven't kept up myself because other soil scientists are doing that work now, but I can, if you want more detailed information on the yields and whether the black soils are declining after 20 years. But from what when I've asked the scientists that are involved, they say, as long as it's managed properly, they're able to hold the carbon levels at a pretty high level, and there hasn't been any significant deterioration, if it's in a continuous cropping no-till system. So even though it was at 8% coming from northern Alberta or central Alberta, we've been able to maintain that organic matter, but we've been able to increase the ones that are 1 or 2%. So I think that's even a positive indication that, and again, you have to remember, this isn't a big, large scale study. These are small research plots, and but they are replicated, and we have it going on at 3 or 4 different locations, also under irrigation as well as dry land. So it's quite an interesting study. It got lots of controversy when we started it, and it made the trucker industry in Southern Alberta pretty happy because we hired all these truckers to haul topsoil from all over Alberta to Lethbridge. So I won't talk about the greenhouse gases that we might have emitted hauling the soil to Lethbridge, but again, it's for the sake of science.
And maybe for a comparison, Vito, do you have the information for Brazil, organic matter in your soils? I know it's a big country.
Yeah,
so.
yeah, no, I was always impressed again in Brazil, when I saw, the crop yields, but again, largely because of their rainfall pattern, they were able to, in a lot of cases, especially some of their sloping land, where I witnessed corn and soybean production on steep slopes that had been no-till for several years, and I stayed on a couple of big no-till farmers in Brazil, and well, he called it soybean on the rocks. That was his terminology, because he could grow 50, 60 bushel soybean crops, even though some of the history of that land had been quite eroded, but he had at least 30 centimeters of soil, maybe, and below that it was almost like a bedrock. But because he wasn't having any additional erosion, he was able, with adequate fertility and no additional erosion, he was able to grow pretty high level production on very shallow topsoil. And it might have been 2 or 3% organic matter. But he also had lots of earthworms.
And probably lots of rainfall. Okay, we have a question from Rick Eistad, and then Maria will go to you.
Rick?
Yeah, Wayne. If the native vegetation under brown soils and dark brown soils was short and long grass, respectively, what was the native vegetation in the black soils typically?
Well, some of it wasn't even grass. It was sort of, they had some forages. Well, I guess it can be a grass, but they also had some agroforestry types, but it was a different type of, trying to think of the species, but there were some grasses, long grasses. It doesn't come to me. I can dig that information up, Rick. But the gray wooded were typically forestry. The black soils were just a different type of deep rooted grass.
Thank you.
Maria, thanks for that. Wayne, Maria, you have a question?
Yes, I have one question. Did it exist some projects that include indigenous people to fix the land or make agroforestry, or maybe some projects with social participation?
Sorry, Maria, I didn't quite catch that.
So I think you're wondering about participation in some of these studies from the Indigenous community? Is that?
Yeah, something like that.
Okay, and then
Yeah,
social
that's
as well.
It's a good question. As I said, not too many of the indigenous communities are involved they're involved in livestock production and pasture management. Very few of our indigenous populations, some of them have gone to college and so on. We've been trying to get more of our indigenous population involved in our agricultural colleges and tech colleges because we think they would have a lot to offer. Because I was always impressed by the elders in my discussions with the indigenous population. They had a very inherent respect for the land, and they took a lot of pride, and that's why they were quite upset. They like getting some of the revenue from rental land, but if it's not being managed properly, they can get quite upset. But we don't have too many. I don't have a lot of evidence, at least in my experience, working with the indigenous population on some of these projects. But I know in one of the recent demonstration, what they call Living Farms project that the Department of Agriculture are starting, that they've invited 2 or 3 of our indigenous populations to participate on the advisory committees. So I think that could be changing in the future, but I don't have any personal experience other than what I've already shared with you.
No, it's a good question, Maria. And from a Rotary perspective in our district, a lot of work is being done with the Indigenous community. There's a significantly higher awareness in more recent years, but in particular in the Lethbridge area, there's been a close connection to many of our Rotarians and the Indigenous population down there. Vitor, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, this question don't have much relation with the presentation, but I was thinking with me this week. Your soils have a lot of percentage of potassium, correct? And so do you have to applicate potassium fertilizers every year, thinking annual crops?
Yeah. Well, we monitor the soil fertility levels on these fields. So we do, obviously fertilizer for continuous crop, but we only, we don't have to put on as much fertilizer as we might do in a conventional tillage operation, because we are getting, more nutrients coming from the organic matter that we're adding to the soil every year. So we're obviously, you have to add fertility to grow a crop. You can't produce a crop without fertility. So you need adequate fertility, but you don't have to add extra fertility. And in some cases, we're able to get by with less fertility because it's got some of the more inherent fertility from the organic matter that we're improving the soil quality. And
Yeah,
again,
I think-
moisture as well. Like, you don't take full advantage of the moisture, extra moisture. Typically, no-till conserves 30 to 40 millimeters more moisture than conventional tillage. So every time you cultivate the land, you lose 10 to 15 millimeters of moisture. So, so to take advantage of that extra moisture, you have to add appropriate fertility, to take advantage of that water. You want to make sure you're using all the water. So sometimes that takes supplemental nitrogen particularly, but we don't have to add any phosphorus or potassium typically.
And to your point, Vitor, the crop rotation makes a difference. And some of that cover crop, when we went away from summer fallow, was legume crops like lentils that fix the nitrogen and actually regenerate nitrogen as well. So
yeah, our most productive rotations here are typically a cereal with a legume following a cereal, legume, and an oil seed. So as long as we have a pulse crop or a legume once in 3 years, we have fewer disease and insect problems with any type of cereal we're growing. But as you heard from some of our speakers in the second week, I think, you're going to have some issues with disease or some pest problems if you grow the same crop 2 years in a row or more often, especially with the row crops like potatoes and sugar beets. They require other cover crops or alternate crops. Otherwise, you got disease problem. And the big problem, with potatoes and sugar beets is they don't provide a lot of organic matter back into the soil. That's one of the problems with row crops is they don't put much organic matter back in the soil. That's why it's important to have a rotation with a forage or a cover crop or a cereal, because most of the row crops put very little organic matter back into the soil.
Yeah, here is similar. The most common rotation that we have is soybean, after that corn, and in some places wheat on our winter here. Or first we put just bean, after that corn and wheat. So it's similar.
yeah, and it's the challenge we've heard from other speakers. Canola for us is the oil seed, and it's the highest revenue per acre. And so the temptation is to do it more often, but long-term, the effect is not positive.
It's the same as here with soybean. And I asked it to a professor last week. The revenue here in Brazil from canola and soybean, it's very similar. It's very close, the revenue. But here we don't have much technology to plant canola. So, but it's growing. We have some programs here to develop the crop in Brazil.
Great. Wayne, I don't see any more questions. Any final remarks from you?
No, I thank you for the great questions. As I said, there's 4 or 5 slides that will be included in my presentation on Wednesday. I thought I'd get a jump start on it, but I'd rather have the questions, and nobody's going to miss anything. I'm going to show my last 4 or 5 slides on Wednesday, since they tied in closely with my work on the greenhouse gases and soil carbon as well. So nobody's going to miss anything. And plus, they've already have the slides if they want to look over that information.
Oh, that's terrific. Well, thank you, Wayne, for sharing your experience with everyone today. You've been a leader in this topic, so for us to have you present to us today was wonderful. So thank you for that. I also want to thank Brad Sewell. He is managing the Zoom for us today. He's our technical guy, so he's another Rotarian that stepped in to help us as well.
Yeah,
and with that concludes our session for today. We look forward to seeing you all same time, same Zoom channel on Wednesday. More great information from Wayne. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening.
Good. Thank you.
Graham, just a reminder to everybody that Friday's session is on Thursday.
Right. Friday session is on Thursday. It's in the slides as well. Right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Goodbye.
Brad, can you save the the captioning, the live transcript, please? Great job, Wayne.
Thank you so much. Glad
Yeah.
it was good.
Yeah, very well done. I can honestly say I learned a lot more today than
Anytime I can listen to a fellow engineer, I learn lots. So.
Okay, I won't push it that far. Come on, guys. I
Thanks
was
again.
going to ask you, one of my questions, Wayne, was that picture with all the John Deere combines there given to you by Graham?
No,
I had
was
to put
that?
something in for Graham there.
Yeah, I loved it. It just,
Yeah.
it looks like a
Oh, I
Hutterite colony. I bet you, because
it's
it's windroad, so it's Western Canadian, and it's either a big, what do you call it, custom operator in Lethbridge, which has a number of them, or a Hutterite colony. But I think it's a custom operator.
You're not
That's probably-
sure it's Ben Walters?